December 1940. Britain is broke. Nazi bombers rain fire on London nightly, and Winston Churchill faces a crisis more terrifying than the Luftwaffe. Bankruptcy. Britain has been buying American weapons on a cash-and-carry basis, but the treasury is empty. In just weeks, the checks will bounce, the shipments will stop, and Hitler will win by default. Churchill sends a desperate, 4,000-word letter to Franklin Roosevelt, the most important financial plea in history. He's not asking for charity. He's offering collateral: British military bases, gold reserves, even the Crown's private investments. But Roosevelt has a bigger plan. What happened next wasn't just a loan. It was the greatest geopolitical transaction ever executed. A $30 billion program that would dismantle the British Empire, establish American supremacy, and reshape the entire global order. This is the story of how America bought the 20th century. For 3 centuries, Britain ruled the waves and controlled global commerce. The British Empire covered a quarter of Earth's land surface. British naval power enforced a trade system called imperial preference. Colonies traded exclusively with London, enriching the mother country while keeping competitors like America locked out of the world's most lucrative markets. But World War II was different. This was industrial warfare at a scale that exceeded even Britain's vast resources. When war erupted in September 1939, Britain immediately needed American weapons, aircraft, and raw materials. The problem? American law. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s strictly prohibited lending money to countries at war. Congress, scarred by World War I debt defaults, wanted no part of Europe's conflicts. So Roosevelt crafted a compromise: cash and carry. If you wanted American weapons, you paid in gold or dollars up front, and you shipped them yourself. No credit, no American involvement, cash on delivery. For Britain, this seemed manageable at first. The empire had resources: gold reserves in the Bank of England, dollar holdings, investments in American companies. Chancellor of the Exchequer Sir John Simon assured Parliament that Britain could finance the war for at least 3 years. He was catastrophically wrong. By June 1940, France had fallen. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Churchill ordered a massive acceleration of American purchases: fighter aircraft, tanks, ammunition, merchant ships, food, steel, oil. The shopping list grew exponentially. Britain was buying $10 million worth of American goods per day. That's approximately $220 million daily in modern terms. The gold flowed out of London in an unprecedented hemorrhage of wealth. British ships carried 2,000 tons of gold bullion across submarine-infested waters to vaults in New York and Ottawa. The Crown sold off private investments, British-owned stocks in American corporations, properties, patents. Treasury officials liquidated assets at fire sale prices just to keep the weapons flowing. By December 1940, Britain had spent over $4.5 billion, roughly $100 billion in today's money. The treasury was empty. Britain had perhaps 6 weeks of purchasing power left. Churchill faced the unthinkable, telling Roosevelt that the checks would soon bounce, the weapons would stop, and Britain would have to negotiate surrender terms with Hitler. The official story says Roosevelt created Lend-Lease out of generosity to help Britain in its darkest hour. The real story is about the price America extracted for that help, and how Roosevelt used Britain's desperation to execute the most profitable geopolitical transaction in history. Let's talk about how fast Britain burned through its wealth. In September 1939, Britain's gold and dollar reserves totaled approximately $4.5 billion. By December 1940, just 16 months later, those reserves had fallen to $574 million. Britain had spent 87% of its liquid assets. Think of it this way: Britain was buying the equivalent of 200 Sherman tanks, 350 fighter aircraft, and 50,000 tons of steel every single week. At full price, in gold, with no credit terms. The human cost of this financial drain was staggering. Britain desperately needed food imports. The island produced only 30% of its own food supply. But paying for American wheat and beef meant less money for fighters and destroyers. Treasury officials calculated the grim arithmetic. Every cargo ship of grain they bought was one less squadron of Spitfires. Churchill personally reviewed the financial reports each week. watching the reserves evaporate. His private secretary John Colville recorded Churchill's exact words in December 1940. "We are not only going to be reduced to utter impoverishment, we are going to be reduced to being a small island, with a strong people, but utterly incapable of defending themselves." The American State Department knew exactly what was happening. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau received weekly cables detailing Britain's asset liquidations. American negotiators watched British officials sell Crown-owned properties in Manhattan for a fraction of their value. They saw Britain liquidate its controlling stake in the American Viscose Corporation, worth perhaps $150 million, for just $54 million in an emergency sale. But here's what they don't teach you. Roosevelt wanted Britain desperate. The president had been planning for this moment. Since 1937, Roosevelt had watched Britain's imperial preference system lock American companies out of markets from India to Africa. He'd seen British diplomats use economic leverage to dominate international negotiations. Roosevelt believed the British Empire was an obstacle to American expansion and to his vision of a post-war world order led by Washington. Now, with Britain on the financial edge, Roosevelt had the leverage he needed. In November 1940, Churchill sent his most trusted advisor, Lord Lothian, to Washington with a message. Britain needed credit and needed it immediately. Lothian met with reporters at LaGuardia Airport and delivered one of history's most consequential quotes. "Well, boys, Britain's broke. It's your money we want." The statement caused a sensation. Isolationist senators demanded Britain be cut off. Let them sell more assets or surrender. But Roosevelt had been preparing his countermove for months. He spent a December weekend on a Navy cruiser in the Caribbean. Thinking through the mechanics of his plan, on December 17, 1940, Roosevelt held a press conference and unveiled his concept. He wouldn't loan Britain money. That was politically impossible and legally questionable. Instead, he'd lend or lease them weapons directly. Britain wouldn't need to pay cash up front. America would simply keep a tally, and Britain would repay after the war somehow. Roosevelt used a folksy metaphor. If your neighbor's house is on fire and he needs your garden hose, you don't haggle over the price. You lend him the hose, and he returns it when the fire is out. It sounded generous. It sounded like America was stepping up to help a friend in need. But the draft legislation Roosevelt sent to Congress contained clauses that would gut the British Empire more thoroughly than Hitler's armies ever could. The real price wasn't financial, it was geopolitical, and Churchill had no choice but to pay it. The Lend-Lease Act became law on March 11, 1941. Congress authorized $7 billion initially, approximately $150 billion in today's dollars. Eventually, the program would distribute over $50 billion in aid, with $31.4 billion going to Britain alone. That's roughly $630 billion in modern terms. Roosevelt called it an arsenal of democracy. American factories would produce tanks, planes, ships, and ammunition. These would be lent or leased to Britain and other allies. After the war, Britain would return whatever equipment remained intact. For the consumed or destroyed material, the two nations would negotiate repayment in kind. Britain celebrated. Churchill called it the most unsorted act in history. Parliament cheered. The weapons and supplies started flowing immediately. Bombers from Detroit, tanks from Pennsylvania, grain from Kansas. But here's what really happened. Roosevelt embedded economic clauses in the Lend-Lease agreements that functionally dismantled Britain's economic sovereignty. Clause 1 was Article 7, innocuously titled, Consideration for Aid. The language seemed bland. Britain agreed to the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. Sounds reasonable, right? Wrong. This clause specifically targeted imperial preference, the cornerstone of British economic power. For 150 years, Britain had forced its colonies to trade primarily with London, giving British manufacturers preferential access to raw materials and consumer markets across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. This system enriched Britain and locked out American competitors. Article 7 effectively outlawed it. Britain agreed to dismantle trade barriers and open colonial markets to international competition, which in practice meant American competition. Roosevelt's advisors explicitly understood this as a condition for aid. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had spent years fighting imperial preference. Now, with Britain desperate for weapons, Hull had the leverage to kill it. British negotiators protested. Chancellor of the Exchequer Kingsley would warn Churchill that accepting Article 7 would amount to an economic Munich. Colonial Secretary Lord Cranborne argued it would trigger independence movements across the empire, as colonies realized they no longer needed Britain as an economic intermediary. Churchill overruled them all. Britain needed the weapons more than it needed economic independence. On February 23, 1942, Churchill signed the Lend-Lease Master Agreement, including Article 7. The British Empire's economic foundation had just been sold to pay for immediate survival. But Roosevelt extracted more than trade concessions. The Lend-Lease agreements included provisions requiring Britain to share military technology. Britain had to transfer its radar technology, jet engine designs, and early atomic research to American scientists. Technology Britain had developed at enormous cost now became American property. Except American military bases, the September 1940 destroyers for bases deal, technically separate from Lend-Lease but part of the same negotiation, gave America 99-year leases on British bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, and the Caribbean. These weren't symbolic outposts. They were strategic locations that projected American naval power into the Atlantic. Reduce gold and dollar reserves to near zero before receiving aid. Clause 2 of the Lend-Lease Agreement specified that Britain must exhaust its dollar holdings before qualifying for supplies. Roosevelt's team literally inventoried British assets to ensure complete depletion. When Britain discovered a small gold reserve held in South Africa, American negotiators demanded it be shipped to New York before additional aid would flow. Limit exports to pay for American goods. Britain couldn't use Lend-Lease materials to manufacture export goods that would compete with American products. This crippled British manufacturers' ability to earn dollars through trade. The math was brutal. Between 1941 and 1945, Britain received $31.4 billion in Lend-Lease aid. But Britain also made reverse Lend-Lease contributions, providing American forces with bases, supplies, and support worth approximately $6.8 billion. Britain also paid cash for certain items excluded from Lend-Lease, spending another $5.8 billion in direct purchases. Net American aid, roughly $18.8 billion, or about $380 billion today. For that price, America gained control over post-war international trade architecture, military bases projecting power globally, access to British military technology worth billions, the permanent end of Britain as a financial rival, the framework to replace British imperial influence with American soft power. Roosevelt's advisor Harry Hopkins described the strategy in a private memo. "We are not fighting for the old British Empire. We're fighting for a new world order where American principles and American business have access to every market on Earth." Churchill knew he'd been cornered. In a private dinner at Chequers in 1942, Churchill told his doctor, "The Americans have got us where they want us. They are taking advantage of our adversity to clip our wings, to reduce us to a secondary power. When this war is over, it will not be a British victory. It will be an American century." He was right. As the war progressed, the true costs of Lend-Lease became devastatingly clear. Britain wasn't just borrowing weapons, it was mortgaging its future. Let's start with the immediate financial impact. Britain's external debt exploded from approximately £760 million in 1939 to over £3.5 billion by 1945, roughly £160 billion in today's money. Much of this was sterling balances, debts Britain owed to colonies like India for wartime supplies. India alone held £1.3 billion in British IOUs by 1945. But Britain couldn't pay these debts because Article 7 prohibited the currency controls and trade barriers that would have allowed Britain to earn the necessary foreign exchange. India wanted payment. Egypt wanted payment. Britain had no way to pay without American dollars. And getting American dollars required selling more assets or accepting more American conditions. The human cost was staggering. In 1943, while Britain signed away economic sovereignty, Bengal suffered a famine that killed approximately 3 million people. British ships that could have carried grain to India were instead used to transport American Lend-Lease supplies to British forces. Churchill's war cabinet explicitly chose weapons over food. Treasury officials calculated that saving Indian lives would require dollar purchases from America. Dollars Britain didn't have, because Roosevelt's team had inventoried every last reserve. Meanwhile, American negotiators pressed additional demands. In 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, Britain sent economist John Maynard Keynes to negotiate the post-war financial system. Keynes proposed an international clearing union that would balance power between debtor and creditor nations, a system that would give Britain breathing room to recover. The Americans rejected it completely. Harry Dexter White, representing the U.S. Treasury, pushed through a system centered on the dollar, not the pound. The new International Monetary Fund and World Bank would be headquartered in Washington, not London. The dollar, backed by America's $20 billion gold reserve, would become the world's reserve currency, a role the pound had held for a century. Keynes returned to London devastated. He wrote to Chancellor Sir John Anderson, "We negotiated as a supplicant to a creditor. We have been obliged to accept terms which would have been impossible had we still been the world's financial center." The strategic bases deal compounded Britain's loss of sovereignty. The 99-year leases Roosevelt extracted in 1940 gave America control of Newfoundland, monitoring Atlantic shipping lanes; Bermuda, mid-Atlantic naval operations; British Guiana, protecting Caribbean oil supplies; Trinidad, controlling approaches to Panama Canal; Jamaica, projecting power into Central America; the Bahamas, surveilling Cuban waters. These bases cost Britain nothing to build but everything to surrender. They represented 150 years of British naval strategy, now transferred to American control. British naval officers watched American crews occupy facilities British sailors had maintained for generations. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord, privately noted, "We have traded the instruments of our sea power for the temporary use of American equipment. When this war ends, the Royal Navy will operate in an ocean dominated by American bases." The technology transfers were equally devastating. Britain's cavity magnetron, the crucial component in advanced radar, was handed to American manufacturers in 1940. This technology had cost Britain millions to develop and gave the RAF a decisive advantage in air defense. Within 2 years, American companies had patented improvements and were selling radar systems globally, undercutting British manufacturers. Britain's jet engine research, pioneered by Frank Whittle, was similarly transferred. By 1944, American companies were producing jet engines based on British designs, positioning American aerospace firms to dominate the post-war aviation market. Even Britain's atomic research, the Maud Committee's early work on uranium fission, was shared with American scientists in 1941. This became the foundation of the Manhattan Project. When the atomic bomb was finally developed, American officials excluded British scientists from key research stages and refused to share the completed weapon designs, despite Britain's initial contributions. The message was clear: Britain's intellectual property was the price of survival, and America wasn't interested in sharing the benefits. By 1945, Churchill faced the final bill. In August, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Within days, President Truman terminated Lend-Lease immediately and completely. Britain had expected a gradual wind-down. Instead, American supplies stopped flowing overnight. Ships en route to Britain were literally recalled mid-Atlantic. The British economy was prostrate. Industrial production had been entirely focused on wartime needs. Cities were bombed-out ruins. The workforce was exhausted, and now the weapons and supplies Britain needed to rebuild were cut off. Keynes rushed to Washington to negotiate a post-war loan. He asked for $6 billion in grants, compensation for Britain's wartime sacrifices. He argued Britain had fought alone for a year while America profited selling weapons, and deserved generous terms for reconstruction. The Americans offered $3.75 billion at 2% interest, to be repaid starting in 1951. The loan came with conditions. Britain had to make sterling fully convertible within 1 year, further dismantling currency controls. Britain had to ratify Article VII's trade provisions immediately. Keynes called it a financial Dunkirk. But Britain had no choice. The loan was approved in July 1946. Britain wouldn't finish repaying it until December 31, 2006, 60 years later. The final payment was £43 million. Britain had won the war but lost its empire. The price? Approximately $31.4 billion in Lend-Lease, repaid in sovereignty, technology, bases, and permanent economic subordination. America didn't conquer Britain militarily. It simply waited for Britain to become desperate enough to sell everything. The post-war consequences unfolded exactly as Roosevelt's advisors predicted, and as Churchill feared. The sterling crisis hit first. In 1947, Britain honored its loan agreement and made the pound convertible to dollars. Within 6 weeks, Britain's dollar reserves evaporated as every country holding wartime sterling balances rushed to convert them. Britain had to suspend convertibility after just 37 days, having burned through $850 million, a quarter of the American loan. The crisis proved Britain could no longer function as an independent financial power. The pound would never again rival the dollar. London's role as the world's financial capital was over. Wall Street had won. Then came decolonization, rapid, chaotic, and directly caused by Article VII's trade provisions. India was first. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan, ending 200 years of British rule. The official story credits Mahatma Gandhi's moral campaign. The economic reality? Britain could no longer afford to administer India. Without imperial preference, India no longer needed Britain as a trade intermediary. Article 7 had opened Indian markets to direct American trade. Britain couldn't justify the military and administrative costs of holding the subcontinent when it no longer generated captive profits. India held £1.3 billion in unpayable sterling balances. Britain's choice was simple. Grant independence or face debt default and potential rebellion it couldn't afford to suppress. Burma followed in 1948. Ceylon in 1948. Palestine in 1948, Britain literally abandoned the mandate, unable to afford peacekeeping costs. Malaya, Singapore, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria. The empire unraveled at breathtaking speed. Between 1947 and 1967, Britain granted independence to 47 colonies. Each colony that departed took with it markets, resources, and strategic positions Britain had controlled for generations. American companies moved in immediately. U.S. oil firms secured Middle Eastern concessions. American manufacturers captured African consumer markets. American banks financed infrastructure projects across Asia. The Suez Crisis of 1956 delivered the final humiliation. When Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France launched a military operation to retake it, the old imperial playbook. British paratroopers seized the canal zone. Victory seemed assured. Then President Eisenhower made a phone call. America refused to support the operation. Worse, Eisenhower threatened to dump American holdings of British bonds, which would trigger a catastrophic run on the pound. Chancellor Harold Macmillan calculated Britain had dollar reserves for perhaps 2 weeks before bankruptcy. Prime Minister Anthony Eden had no choice. Britain withdrew. British troops evacuated the canal zone in disgrace. It was the last time Britain attempted independent military action against American wishes. The message was unmistakable. Britain was now a client state. The special relationship Churchill had championed was special only in Britain's willingness to follow American directions. Let's calculate the total cost of Lend-Lease in terms of what Britain actually lost. Financial losses. Direct Lend-Lease debt, $31.4 billion, $630 billion today. Post-war loan, $3.75 billion. Repaid over 60 years with interest. Approximately $7.5 billion total. Sterling balances, £3.5 billion written off or repaid at devastating exchange rates. Asset sales. Approximately $2 billion in pre-war investments liquidated at fire sale prices. Total financial cost. Roughly $44.65 billion nominal, or nearly $900 billion today. Strategic losses. 99-year leases on 8 major military bases. Control of Atlantic and Caribbean strategic positions. Naval dominance replaced by American naval supremacy. Reserve currency status, the pound replaced by the dollar. Independent financial policy, Britain subject to IMF/World Bank conditions. Economic losses. Imperial preference system dismantled. Captive colonial markets opened to American competition. Export capacity crippled by Lend-Lease conditions. Industrial base oriented toward American supply chains. Technology leadership transferred to American firms. Territorial losses. 47 colonies gaining independence 1947 to 1967. Loss of Indian subcontinent. 450 million people. Loss of Middle Eastern influence and oil concessions. Loss of African colonies and resources. Reduction from global empire to mid-sized European nation. What started as a $7 billion emergency aid package in 1941 became the mechanism for history's greatest peaceful transfer of power. But here's what they don't tell you. It wasn't an accident. Declassified State Department memos from 1941 to 1945 show American planners explicitly designed Lend-Lease to create financial dependence and position American commerce to inherit British imperial markets. A 1943 memo from Assistant Secretary of State Dean Acheson stated, "The British Empire as currently constituted is incompatible with American security and prosperity. Our objective is not its destruction but its transformation into economic spheres accessible to American enterprise." Roosevelt never publicly admitted this strategy. In speeches, he emphasized humanitarian aid and democratic solidarity. But his private correspondence reveals the calculation. In a 1942 letter to Churchill, Roosevelt wrote, "The old empires are dying. What replaces them must be open systems, not closed clubs. Britain will emerge from this war victorious but fundamentally changed. That change is the price of American support." Today, we still see the echoes of this transaction everywhere. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency, a direct result of Bretton Woods and Britain's financial exhaustion. American military bases encircle the globe. Starting with those 99-year leases from 1940, the IMF and World Bank set global economic rules. Headquartered in Washington, not London, English-speaking world leadership passed from London to Washington. The special relationship is special because Britain follows American guidance. Post-colonial nations often aligned with Washington, not London, because America positioned itself as anti-imperial, even while building a new form of empire. The American century didn't begin with military conquest. It began with a desperate prime minister in December 1940, writing a 4,000-word letter begging for weapons, and a calculating president who saw an opportunity to execute the greatest geopolitical transaction in history. Britain got the weapons it needed to survive. America got the world. In 1940, Britain faced annihilation. Churchill needed weapons immediately, and Roosevelt provided them. The price? Everything Britain had spent 3 centuries building. The deal was struck in a matter of months, formalized in treaties filled with dry legal language about consideration for aid and post-war trade arrangements. But the true transaction was clear. Britain traded its empire, its financial independence, its strategic bases, its technology, and its global dominance for $31.4 billion in weapons and supplies. What seemed like generous aid was actually the most profitable investment in American history. For approximately $31.4 billion, roughly $630 billion today, America acquired global supremacy, permanent military bases, control of international finance, access to every market previously closed by imperial preference, and the transformation of its only rival into a loyal client state. The British Empire didn't fall to Nazi Germany. It was sold piece by piece to pay for American weapons. And the deal was so well constructed that most people still believe America was simply being generous. Follow the money, and you see the truth. World War II's most decisive battle wasn't fought in Normandy or Stalingrad. It was fought in treasury offices and diplomatic suites, where Roosevelt's negotiators systematically dismantled British power while British officials, desperate and exhausted, signed away the future. Today, when we talk about the special relationship between America and Britain, we're really talking about the aftermath of that deal, the relationship between the seller and the buyer, the debtor and the creditor, the empire that was and the superpower that replaced it. The cost of survival was empire itself. and America collected every penny.